The earth lay submerged in sin. It was not the clean immersion of a baptism in clear water, it was a drowning in moral mire, a thick and viscous sludge that had seeped into every crack of existence, altering the very essence of creation. The ground itself seemed corrupt, crops grew with a sickly hue, and the water of the springs, though physically drinkable, left a bitter aftertaste upon the soul. Wickedness had become the air itself, and to breathe was an act of complicity. Each dawn, that cosmic ritual meant to renew hope, instead carried with it the mathematical certainty of further perversion. The sun rose with resigned slowness over a world that no longer deserved its warmth. Its first rays did not illuminate the dew, they exposed the livid remnants of the night, the bodies of the forgotten in alleyways, the dark stains in public squares that no one bothered to clean, and the dull gleam in the eyes of the sentinels, who had stood watch not to protect, but to partake. The cities, once conceived as beacons of civilization and progress, Enoch, Irad, Zillah the Proud, had been transformed into grotesque monuments to human arrogance. They were festering scars of pride upon the face of the earth. Their towers, built of polished basalt and meteoric iron, pointed toward the heavens in open defiance, like accusing fingers challenging the Creator. They were obsidian spires that did not reflect sunlight, they seemed to drink it in, devour it, casting perpetual shadows over crowded streets. The architecture itself was blasphemy, impossible angles that nauseated the eye, structures designed to diminish the individual and glorify the power of a humanity that believed itself its own god. The city walls, raised generations earlier under the pretense of protection and community, now served the opposite function. They enclosed gardens of evil. No longer did they keep danger out, they imprisoned corruption and kept out any trace of purity. Within those fortified perimeters, innocence was systematically hunted, cornered, and sacrificed upon altars of immediate pleasure and corrupt power. Every street, every square, every corner of the antediluvian cities resounded with institutionalized depravity. The shrill laughter of a matron wagering the life of her servant in a dice game echoed against marble porticos. The sharp crack of a taskmaster's whip against the back of an exhausted laborer marked the rhythm of progress. Depravity was not committed in secret, it was the connective tissue of society, celebrated in broad daylight, taught in schools, and legislated in courts. The very air bore the tangible weight of this generalized corruption. It was a miasma, a perpetual haze not of water but of the collective exhalation of vice, an atmospheric burden that oppressed the lungs and saddened the spirit. A nauseating mixture of incense burned in profane rituals, a dense smoke of nard, sulfur, and black poppy, mingled with the metallic stench of blood. Blood was everywhere, in slaughterhouses operating in public squares, on the altars of dark temples, and in the sewers, where the smell of rusted iron clung to the back of the throat. Added to this was the cloying aroma of moral decay, the scent of rotting fruit and decomposition that emanated from every social pore, like a corpse that has died yet refuses to acknowledge it. The ambient sounds formed a demonic cacophony that never ceased, a symphony of chaos tuned to selfishness. Laughter expressed no genuine joy, it revealed sadistic cruelty, the sharp delight of those who viewed suffering as the finest entertainment. Cries of pain found ironic echo in triumphant war chants, where feats of conquest were nothing more than the glorification of theft and large-scale massacre. The horrific crunch of broken bones beneath the wheels of ornate carriages carried human cargo, slaves bound for salt mines or bloodthirsty altars. And like a constant pulse, metal rang against metal. It was not the sound of a plow opening fertile soil, it was the forges of Tubal-Cain and his descendants, hammering bronze and iron for new oppressions and massacres. Children, those pure souls meant to be protected and nurtured as the future of the race, instead of playing innocently, mimicked parental vices with terrifying precision. They were miniature tyrants. Their childhood games had become macabre simulations of violence and domination. Their playing house was a parody of betrayal and adultery witnessed in their homes. Their playing war left real wounds, and the weakest always lost cruelly, learning from the earliest age that compassion was synonymous with weakness and empathy a defect to be beaten and purged. Their laughter was stripped of innocence, sharp, calculating, and cold. The elderly, who in a healthy society should have been honored for their accumulated wisdom and life experience, were openly despised. Longevity, a divine gift spanning centuries, had become a social burden. They were seen not as sources of wisdom, but as useless mouths, physical hindrances in a world obsessed with brute strength and instant gratification. They were abandoned in public squares or along roadsides, hands outstretched, begging for scraps of compassion in a world that had completely forgotten the meaning of the word. Youth passed them with disdain, sometimes kicking over their empty bowls for amusement, viewing their weakness as an aesthetic offense. Even the animals, innocent creation itself, reflected this universal corruption. Domesticated beasts, such as great mastiffs bred for guarding, increasingly turned on their masters, seized by an unnatural fury that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Birds, instead of building nests with soft branches and moss, wove them with thorns and sharp objects, as though nature itself had been perverted and no longer knew how to nurture its young. The rivers themselves seemed to flow more slowly, their waters thick and turbid, not merely from sediment, but laden with the moral and physical waste of a civilization in terminal decay. They were a toxic broth of filth and blood, and fish died along their banks, bellies swollen toward an indifferent sky. In the temples, those sacred spaces where humanity had once sought the divine with sincere hearts, dark arts and blasphemous rituals were now practiced. Statues of false gods, with multiple arms and faces twisted by lust and power, demanded ever more depraved sacrifices. Priests who should have been spiritual guides and models of virtue had become cynical sorcerers, eyes bloodshot from black poppy smoke, hands permanently stained. They sold curses and potions of forgetfulness to the highest bidder, whispering promises of temporal power in exchange for eternal allegiance of the soul. Genuine worship had been entirely replaced by complex rituals invoking demons and sealing bloody pacts with shadows and nameless entities in exchange for better harvests or the death of a commercial rival. The seasons themselves seemed affected by this generalized moral corruption. The earth, violated and profaned, responded with agony. Summers grew hotter and more relentless, punishing the land with inexplicable droughts that cracked the soil like an open wound oozing dust. Winters became harsher and longer, with storms of black ice that killed livestock in the fields, as though nature itself protested the evil it housed, refusing to bless those who had defiled it. The earth, originally designed as a garden of delight and harmony, had become a cosmic battlefield where every human fought against every other. War was not the exception, it was the natural state, senseless war for resources, pleasure, and fleeting power. Night no longer brought peace or rest, it revealed horrors worse beneath its cloak of darkness. Rampant orgies under the indifferent moon were not secret acts of rebellion but civic festivals. Ritual human sacrifices to mute stars were performed atop ziggurats to secure fortune. The sound of doors slamming and bolts sliding was not to protect loved ones, but to conceal unspeakable secrets and nameless crimes from neighbors. The very concept of family had completely disintegrated. It was a unit of convenience, not affection. Parents sold children for trivial debts or momentary pleasures. Husbands betrayed wives as though it were a cruel sport, and wives responded with poison and deceit. Brothers became mortal enemies over trivial inheritances or meaningless grudges, and parricide was a common theme in popular songs. Justice was a macabre mockery, a grotesque pantomime of what it once had been. The scales held by statues before the courts were ironic ornaments. Corrupt judges, robes stained with wine and bribes, sold verdicts to the highest bidder without the slightest remorse. The judge's gavel fell not to the rhythm of truth, but to the sound of gold. Guards meant to protect citizens openly shielded criminal syndicates and systematically oppressed the innocent, for innocence was easy prey. Laws were written and rewritten not to establish order and equity, but to consolidate the power of corrupt rulers and their henchmen, creating legal labyrinths where only the wealthy and ruthless could find an exit. Music, an art meant to lift the soul toward the divine and connect humanity with transcendent beauty, had become hypnotic, repetitive rhythms driven by drums of human skin, openly inciting violence and unrestrained lust. They sought not harmony, but frenzy. Art no longer sought to capture beauty, it celebrated the grotesque and perverse as the ultimate expression of misunderstood freedom. The most famous sculptors were those who best captured agony in marble, and the most lauded poets those who composed the vilest odes to betrayal. Medicine, which should have alleviated suffering and restored health, healed nothing. It had become a tool of power. Physicians deliberately prolonged suffering for financial gain, keeping patients in states of controlled agony to extract greater wealth from desperate families. The doctor was not a healer but an extortionist trafficking in pain. Agriculture, instead of feeding life, slowly poisoned all with crops grown through blasphemous methods, irrigated with contaminated water and consecrated with bloody sacrifices to false deities that demanded ever more suffering. Commerce was a sophisticated system of institutionalized theft in which the strong always devoured the weak without remorse, viewing exploitation not as vice, but as supreme entrepreneurial virtue. There remained not a single pure corner on earth. Not a single completely clean thought in the human mind. Not a single genuinely selfless action in the human heart. Every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of conscious existence was contaminated by a total corruption that had reached cosmic proportions. It had infected not only humanity, but resonated through the very fabric of reality. Humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. They had sealed their collective fate not with a single spectacular act of evil, but with millions of small acts of daily cruelty, systematic selfishness, and gradual perversion, accumulating like raindrops into an ocean of wickedness that now overflowed all moral boundaries. Divine patience, extended mercifully through generations, offering chance after chance for genuine repentance, had finally reached its absolute limit. Creation itself groaned beneath an unbearable moral weight, a cosmic lament resonating in every atom. Trees seemed perpetually bowed, not by wind, but by the burden of what they were forced to witness day after day. Rocks bore deep fissures, not from erosion, but as if unable to endure such wickedness without breaking in shame. Rivers flowed sluggishly toward the sea, as though longing to wash themselves of the spiritual contamination they carried. The sun seemed dimmer, the moon paler, the stars more distant, as though the entire cosmos recoiled in palpable disgust from this stain of corruption upon a once perfect creation. And in the midst of this desolate landscape of absolute moral darkness, a single point of light remained. It was not a defiant torch nor a guiding beacon. It was faint yet unbreakable, like the last candle in an eternal night that stubbornly refused to be extinguished by the hurricane winds of unleashed evil. That point of light was a man named Noah. Walking through the streets of the nearest city was a spiritual torment for Noah. He was not a hermit, he was a family man, a farmer, a builder. He had to trade. He had to move among them. He saw the merchant who used falsified weights, the magistrate who accepted a bribe in broad daylight, the children who tortured a dog in the gutter. And they saw him. His personal integrity shone all the more brightly precisely because everything around him was profound darkness. His righteousness was neither loud nor ostentatious. He did not preach on street corners nor condemn aloud. His justice was quiet and constant. It consisted of paying a fair price even when he knew he was being cheated, treating his few servants with dignity, remaining faithful to his wife, Naamah, and teaching his sons a path the world had abandoned centuries earlier. This simple, plain decency was in itself a silent insult to all who saw him. When he went to the market, the merchants mocked him. "Here comes the righteous one," they whispered sarcastically. "Careful, don't offend him with your profits." They avoided him, excluded him, treated him like a moral leper. Even his distant relatives had stopped inviting him to festivities, weary of his quiet refusal to participate in their fraudulent dealings or lascivious rituals. He endured the disgrace, returning home each evening with the weight of the world upon his shoulders. He looked at his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and saw in their eyes the confusion of growing up in a world that taught them that everything their father represented was weakness. In those moments, he felt the unshakable faith that God still saw and that his ways were right. He felt a deep fear for the souls of his sons, dreading that the overwhelming pressure of the outside world might eventually fracture their innocence. And he held on to a restrained hope, barely a dying ember, that something might break that suffocating monotony of wickedness. His righteousness was like the persevering heartbeat of creation itself, which still faintly remembered the Creator's original design. Divine communication came one such evening. Noah was not in a temple, nor offering a sacrifice. He was in the field, inspecting his olive trees, feeling the dry, diseased soil beneath his hands, wondering whether it was worth planting again. It was not thunder shaking the heavens, nor the appearance of a being of fire. It was a silent certainty that rose from the deepest part of his being. An intimate knowledge that settled into his spirit with the cold, crystalline clarity of spring water in the midst of a moral desert. It was not audible words vibrating in his ears, it was an immediate and complete understanding that filled every fiber of his consciousness with the terrible truth and the glorious responsibility that would forever change the course of human history. "I have decided the end of all flesh," the truth resounded in his innermost being. "For the earth is filled with violence because of them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth." The words did not come with the furious wrath of a vengeful, impulsive God, they came saturated with infinite sorrow, the searing pain of a creator, of an artist, who must decide to destroy his own masterpiece because the corruption has become unmanageable. It was the grief of a father forced to discipline his rebellious children to the extreme point of total annihilation. Noah felt that cosmic sorrow as if it were his own. The magnitude of divine grief was so overwhelming that it pierced his chest like a spiritual spear and caused his knees to buckle. He fell to the dust, not from fear of the coming punishment, but from sharing the divine sorrow over the tragic necessity of this final judgment. His shoulders shook, but no sound escaped his lips. Then came the instruction, specific, detailed with millimetric precision, as though a celestial architect were dictating notes into his mind. The complex plans of salvation were engraved upon his consciousness with a clarity that transcended all normal human understanding. "Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make rooms in the ark, and you shall cover it with pitch inside and out." The specified dimensions were colossal, absurd, nearly impossible for the technology and human capacity of the time. Noah, a man accustomed to building barns and fences, stood up and measured the dry ground of his field with his steps. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. He walked the 300 long steps and stopped, turning back to look at the starting point. The scale was that of a palace, a floating fortress. A vessel the size of a modern battlefield, a structure that defied conventional logic, designed not to sail known seas, but to survive a cosmic catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. And of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you, male and female they shall be. The magnitude of the task was overwhelming to the human mind. The command seemed absurd from every rational perspective. The cosmic responsibility placed upon his shoulders was a weight that would have crushed any other mortal. How? How would he find gopher wood in such quantity? How would he gather all the creatures? How would he house them? But Noah, with silent tears tracing the deep lines of his face, etched by decades of honest labor under the sun, looked up at the darkening sky. In that moment of truth, faith that the one who gave the command would also provide the means sustained him. Fear of failing at so divine a task was softened by the hope that obedience itself would be enough. He nodded in immediate and unconditional obedience. There was no internal debate. No negotiation asking for a clearer sign. No request for clarification or modification. Only total acceptance of a calling he knew came from the very source of all existence. That very night, as they shared the family meal in the comforting dimness of their home, a refuge of sanity in a mad world, Noah gathered his household. The smell of stew and warm bread filled the air, but the solemnity on the patriarch's face made the tent heavy with eternal significance. Naamah, his wife, stopped serving. Shem, Ham, and Japheth fixed their gaze upon him. His words were measured and careful, his tone calm yet infused with a gravity that pierced the walls of time itself. He told them the truth that would change their lives forever. The world was going to end, and they were going to build the vessel that would save the future. Shem, the eldest, whose face reflected the same unbreakable integrity he had learned from his father's example, listened to every word and nodded solemnly. He did not question, he only asked, "When do we begin?" Ham, the second, showed initial skepticism. His eyes shifted uneasily. "A ship? Here, father. 10 days from the sea. People will laugh. They'll say you've lost your mind." But when he saw the absolute certainty, the supernatural light in Noah's eyes, his skepticism transformed into resigned determination. In that tense silence, his faith wrestled with fear of shame, sustained by hope for the future. Japheth, the youngest, asked practical questions with the innocence of one who could not yet grasp the apocalyptic magnitude. Will it be bigger than the Temple of Enoch? And where will we put the lions? The daughters-in-law, wives of his sons, exchanged glances heavy with genuine concern and barely contained fear. One of them pressed her hand to her womb, thinking of a future that now seemed erased. But Noah's unshakable faith was as contagious as sacred fire. It was not the fervor of a madman, but the absolute calm of a man who had received a purpose. Soon, every member of the family found themselves united in this divine mission that transcended their immediate human understanding. In that unity of purpose, fear was shared, and hope for collective salvation drove them forward. The construction began at the following dawn. That dawn did not bring the comfort of routine, the simple task of plowing a field or pruning an olive tree. It brought the crushing weight of the impossible. Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth stood before the first grove of gopher trees that the Creator had impressed upon the patriarch's mind. They were not slender trees, they were ancient, titans of the antediluvian earth, with trunks so wide that 3 men holding hands could barely encircle them. Their wood, almost black in color, was incredibly dense, resinous, and heavy, designed by nature to resist time and decay. Now, it would be designed by God to withstand the end of the world. Noah, a man who counted his years in centuries, stepped forward. His sons watched in silence. He raised the heavy bronze axe, a metal that represented the pinnacle of human technology. The air was still. The first blow echoed through the valley not as a clean crack, but as a dull, deep thud. The wood barely flinched, spitting out only a small splinter. A fleeting smile of disbelief and momentary despair crossed Ham's face. He looked at Shem, seeking complicity in the madness of the task. But Shem had already lifted his own axe, his face a mask of determination. Japheth, ever practical, examined the angle of his father's cut and chose a spot of his own. The first gopher trees fell with a sound that did not seem of this world. It was not a simple creak. It was a deep lament, a muted cry that tore through the morning silence, a groan that seemed to rise from the earth itself, as though creation were protesting its own dismantling, even if it was for its own salvation. The final thunder, when the first titan crashed to the ground, made the earth tremble beneath their feet and silenced the birds for miles around. They had taken an entire day to fell a single tree. And they needed thousands. Every axe stroke was an audible declaration of faith in the invisible. Every flying splinter was an act of defiance against the logic of the world. Every drop of sweat soaking their tunics was a liquid prayer. Every plank, cut with agonizing precision using bronze saws that constantly dulled, was a tangible act of obedience that resonated in the spiritual realms. Noah, despite his advanced age, worked with the renewed energy of a man possessed by a sacred purpose. This bewildered his sons. They saw their father, his hair white as the snow on distant peaks, lifting beams that made their own young muscles cry out in pain. But it was not the strength of youth that drove him, it was the strength of divine certainty. His aged muscles, accustomed to the labor of the fields, found a power that could come only from conviction. With every beam, he renewed his faith, overcoming fear of the immense task with the hope of seeing the structure completed. His sons were the engine of the work. They quickly learned the intricate designs their father dictated to them. They became the first naval engineers of a world without oceans. Their young bodies adapted to the extreme physical demands of this monumental task. Shem, the firstborn, worked with methodical devotion, measuring each cut twice, his silence as deep as his father's. Ham, strong and pragmatic, was the fastest but also the most impatient. He muttered curses when a tool broke or a beam failed to fit, his eyes often drifting toward the empty horizon, as if searching for a sign that this madness made sense. Japheth, the youngest, worked with diligent curiosity, absorbing every lesson, his strength compensating for what he lacked in the endurance of his older brothers. The daughters-in-law devoted themselves to support roles that were, in truth, the heart that kept the project alive. Naamah, Noah's wife, directed the logistics with quiet wisdom. They prepared meals to sustain exhausted bodies, carried water from the distant well, ground grain to bake bread in clay ovens, and salted meat for preservation. They maintained the countless tools, hours upon hours each night under the glow of oil lamps, sharpening dulled bronze blades against whetstones. They assisted with the smaller tasks, which were not small at all, weaving thick fiber ropes, gathering resin from fallen trees, and above all, boiling the pitch. The constant sound of the work soon became the permanent soundtrack of their lives, an acoustic accompaniment that defined their days and haunted their nights. It was the relentless metronome of obedience. The distinctive creak of worked gopher wood. The rhythmic pounding of 4, 5, 6 hammers echoing through the valley like drums of destiny, a sound that traveled for miles and soon drew attention. The methodical, agonizing scrape of saws cutting massive trunks, like a giant insect gnawing at the heart of the world. And always in the background, the hypnotic crackle and bubbling of cauldrons of pitch simmering over fires that never went out. The smell was even more invasive. The distinctive scent of freshly cut wood, a clean, resinous perfume, was inseparably mixed with the sharp, acrid, suffocating odor of hot pitch. That tar smell soaked into their clothing. It seeped into their skin, staining their hands black. It clung to their hair. It became a fundamental part of their very identity. From miles away, people could smell them before they saw them. It was the stench of madness, the perfume of salvation. Months turned into years. The family operated in self-imposed isolation, their world reduced to the plans in Noah's mind and the ever-growing pile of wood. First came the keel, a colossal beam so long it defied imagination, set upon blocks of carved stone. Then, slowly, the ribs began to rise one by one, like the bones of an impossible leviathan stranded in the middle of the plain. As the gigantic skeleton of the ark began to rise against the sky like a tangible omen, it became an impossible presence to ignore in the landscape. It was a structure so immense that it permanently altered the visual geography of the entire region. It was larger than any temple, more imposing than any palace of the god-kings of the age, and it stood in the middle of nowhere. The first onlookers arrived cautiously. At first, it was not a crowd. It was a shepherd named Elam, guiding his flock to new pastures, who stopped dead when he saw the impossible structure rising in Noah's valley. He approached with wide eyes, his staff clenched in his hand. He saw the family, their bodies covered in sweat and pitch, their faces marked by a fatigue that seemed decades old. "Noah, son of Lamech," Elam said, his voice trembling between reverence and mockery. "What is this? A new temple to an unknown god? Or a fortress against the giants of the north?" Noah set down his hammer. The sudden silence was deafening. He wiped the sweat from his eyes with a tar-stained forearm. "It is an ark, Elam," Noah replied calmly. Elam frowned. "An ark? Like a giant chest? To store your grain? You must be the richest man in the world." "A ship," Noah corrected gently. The word hung suspended in the dry, dusty air. Elam looked around, at the arid plain stretching in every direction, at the dry bed of the seasonal river that had not seen water in months, at the sky, brilliant and relentless blue, without a single cloud. Then he laughed. At first, it was not cruel laughter. It was the laughter of pure, genuine, incredulous absurdity, a laughter that shook his entire body. "A ship," he exclaimed, slapping his thigh. "Noah, you were always a strange man, but this surpasses everything. A ship? Here, in the middle of the plain where the nearest water is a well. The great river is 10 days' walk away. And what do you plan to do, old man? Pray for rain to fill the valley?" The family stopped working. Shem stared at the ground, his jaw clenched. Ham tightened his grip on the axe handle, his knuckles white. Noah answered with a patience that seemed infinite, a calm more unsettling than any anger. "The rain will come, Elam. A rain like you have never seen. It will fill this valley. And it will cover the hills. And it will cover the mountains. It is the word of the Creator. And He is giving time for repentance." Elam's laughter stopped abruptly. He saw absolute certainty in Noah's eyes. It was not the gaze of a proud builder, nor the spark of a shrewd merchant. It was the gaze of a prophet. And in that corrupt world, nothing was more terrifying, or more worthy of mockery, than moral certainty. Elam stepped back. Madness was one thing, conviction of that magnitude was another. It was dangerous. "You're insane, old man," Elam spat, his tone now thick with contempt. "Your creator has dried out your brain." He turned and hurried back to his flock, as if he feared madness were contagious. Noah watched him go. In that moment, faith sustained him despite the fear that Elam might be the first of many, holding on to the dwindling hope that perhaps one might listen. The visitors left, shaking their heads in disbelief. Elam did not keep silent. He told the story at the next market, in the next tavern. The tale of the madman building a ship on dry land became the joke of the year, a favorite anecdote to share. As time passed and the structure grew year after year, becoming increasingly impossible to ignore, first the frame, then the 3 interior decks, then the outer planking, the mockery grew more cruel and personal. Initial curiosity turned into weekly entertainment. Groups of idle youths from nearby cities came on rest days specifically to laugh at Noah's zoo, or the old man's madness. They brought rotten fruit and stones. In those encounters, Noah's faith was tested, fear of insult became tangible, yet hope in the divine command compelled him to persist. They hurled stones at the developing structure, the dull thud of rock against gopher wood breaking the rhythm of the hammers. They shouted insults that echoed through the valley, "Hey, Noah! Sailing soon. Watch out for the great drought, Captain." One night, they scrawled obscene graffiti on the lower planks, vile images that Ham furiously scraped away at dawn, cursing the vandals and, under his breath, the project that had made them the laughingstock of the world. On one particularly dangerous occasion, a group of enraged drunkards, emboldened by wine and hatred for Noah's implicit righteousness, attempted to set fire to a carefully stacked and cured pile of wood. But just as the flames began to lick the dry timber, a sudden and unusual storm, a rarity for that season, rose out of nowhere. A torrential, unexpected rain arrived at the precise moment, extinguishing the nascent flames and soaking the vandals, who fled screaming that the old man had summoned the demons of the air. Noah saw these constant provocations not as personal attacks deserving retaliation, but as divine tests of his persevering faith. They were the noise of a condemned world, and he was building the vessel of silence and salvation. His faith was strengthened with every blow, overcoming fear of opposition with hope in righteous judgment. Every hammer strike that echoed through the valley was an audible prayer to heaven, a response to mockery. Every plank set with millimetric precision was an act of silent worship. Every wooden peg, carefully fitted and sealed with pitch, was a vow of unbreakable obedience. As he labored tirelessly day after day, year after year, his mind meditated on the dual nature of the coming judgment, the terrifying and necessary justice, and the incomprehensible mercy that inexplicably allowed his family's salvation. He saw his mockers not as enemies deserving contempt, but as drowning souls, already condemned by their own persistent choices. And silent prayers for their ultimate redemption rose from his heart, even as they hurled insults and stones at him. The years passed. Decades accumulated. 50 years. 70. 100. The ark became an established fact in the landscape. It ceased to be a novelty. It was a permanent monument to one man's madness. The children who had thrown stones grew up, had children of their own, and taught them to mock old Noah and his unfinished ship. Construction continued, slow but steady, like the majestic growth of an ancient forest that knows no haste. The ark gradually took shape before their eyes, a wooden monster rising against the sky as a tangible testament to faith in the invisible, madness made material, defying all conventional understanding and human expectation. Noah's family visibly aged in this task. The work consumed their lives and redefined their purposes. Noah's hands developed new calluses over old ones, his palms becoming topographical maps of decades of uninterrupted labor. His faith, in old age, was the engine. His back, already slightly bent from years of agricultural work, curved a little more under the overwhelming weight of cosmic responsibility. His hair, already white when the project began, turned completely white, almost luminous. His sons became mature men before his eyes. They ceased to be apprentices and became master craftsmen, experts who could read the divine plans in their father's mind with the same instinctive ease with which they read the sky to predict the weather. The daughters-in-law bore children during the long years of construction, but the children, born into such a corrupt world and amid such an arduous project, did not survive. They died in infancy, one of fever, another from a fall. Each loss was a deep pain that tore at the family's heart, a pain Noah understood as part of the necessary sacrifice, personal loss within the broader context of global rescue. Each small grave dug on the hill above the ark was another anchor binding them to that land and to that mission. Fear of loss was constant, but hope in the ark's future tempered it. The mockery of onlookers changed in quality with the relentless passage of time. From open, carefree laughter it shifted to morbid curiosity, then to persistent discomfort, and finally to a silent yet palpable hatred that hung in the air. The physical presence of the finished ark, impossible to ignore, was a constant reminder of something they preferred to forget, the unsettling possibility of universal moral judgment, the existence of higher ethical standards, the uncomfortable reality of a God they had collectively turned away from for generations. The structure was no longer a joke, it was an accusation. The leaders of the nearest city, Zillah, sent formal emissaries. They were no longer curious shepherds, but men of power, dressed in fine linen and gold, flanked by guards armed with bronze spears. Noah, son of Lamech, said the principal envoy, a man named Tubal, descendant of the metalworker. The council of Zillah is, impressed, by your perseverance. It is a magnificent structure. A tribute to madness, but magnificent. They offered him substantial riches, fields, livestock, gold, civic honors. Abandon this mad project, Tubal urged, his voice oily. You have already proven your point. Rejoin normal society. We will make you a man of importance. This thing is a monstrosity. It disfigures the landscape and disturbs the people. Noah refused politely, but with unbreakable firmness. I cannot. My work is not for men, but for God. And it is nearly finished. The emissary's smile vanished. Is that your final word, old man? It is the only word, Noah said. They hinted darkly at destroying the ark by brute force. A structure so large, made of so much dry wood, Tubal mused aloud, glancing at the pitch cauldrons. It would be a shame if an accident were to happen. A stray spark. But something restrained them, perhaps a residual respect for Noah's impossible age and superhuman persistence, or a superstitious fear of his invisible God, the only God without a temple filled with gold and sacrifices. Or, more likely, the sheer practical enormity of dismantling or burning such a structure. So they departed, uttering empty threats, leaving the family alone once again. The seasons turned in their eternal cycle as the construction advanced methodically. Spring brought wildflowers blooming around the base of the ark, and Noah saw them as fleeting reminders of the beauty that would soon be irrevocably destroyed. His faith clung to these small signs of life. Summer brought a scorching heat that made the pitch boil and bubble in the cauldrons like a foretaste of the coming hell. Autumn brought multicolored leaves falling onto the ark's deck, silent tears of creation foretelling its own end. Winter brought a penetrating cold that numbed fingers but could not freeze the divine purpose that sustained them. Through all the seasons, for 120 years, the sound of work continued undisturbed, the constant soundtrack of a faith that refused to die in the face of ridicule, open opposition, or general indifference. In the final years, Noah began to notice subtle but unsettling changes in the natural world around them. His deep connection to the Creator allowed him to perceive these signs. Animals behaved strangely and inexplicably. Migratory birds flew in unusual patterns, colliding with one another, out of season. Rodents dug deeper burrows than normal on higher ground. Insects seemed to multiply in anomalous numbers, plagues devouring crops that already struggled to grow. At times the sky took on a sickly greenish tint at dusk, a color he had never seen before in his 600 years of watchful life. The wind seemed to whisper warnings in an ancient language that only his spirit, tuned to the divine, could intuitively understand. He knew with growing certainty that the time of grace was rapidly shortening. Each hammer blow was more urgent than the last. The cosmic clock was striking its final hours. Construction entered its final phase with an urgent pressure that could be felt in the air. The interior of the Ark was a complex labyrinth of compartments designed for precise purposes. 3 complete decks of meticulously planned spaces, cages, stalls, chambers, storehouses, built to shelter all terrestrial life that would remain on the planet. Ingenious ventilation systems were fashioned to allow airflow without letting water in. Food stores were calculated with millimetric precision, mountains of dry grain, pressed hay, dehydrated fruits, salted meat. Freshwater tanks, enough for months of complete autonomy. Everything was built according to divine specifications that transcended the conventional human knowledge of the age. The family now worked with a silent but palpable urgency. They spoke of nothing except the task. They felt in their bones and spirits that the time of grace was approaching its irreversible end. The massive door, a ramp several stories high, was the last piece to be put in place. It had been the final project of the last decade of meticulous labor. When they closed it the first time to test its function, the sound of solid wood locking into its frame echoed through the valley like a solemn omen of the coming judgment, a final boom, an audible period at the end of an entire era of humanity. They left it open, waiting. And then the outside world changed. The shift in the atmosphere began almost imperceptibly. It was not thunder, nor an earthquake. It was the opposite. First came the sudden, unsettling silence. For 120 years, the soundtrack of their lives had been work and mockery, the rhythmic pounding of hammers and the cacophonous chorus of insults. But that day, on the morning of the first day of the final week, the sound stopped. A group of travelers, coming as usual to hurl their morning jeers at Noah's floating palace, halted 100 meters away. They opened their mouths to shout, but the words died in their throats. The air had turned heavy, thick, as if charged with static electricity that clung to the skin and raised the hair at the nape of the neck. The Ark, now complete, sealed with pitch that gleamed like obsidian beneath the pale sun, no longer looked like an old man's madness. It looked like judgment. The mockers backed away in silence, faces pale, and for the first time in their lives they hurried back to the city, not for amusement, but driven by a fear they could not name. Then came the deeper, blood-chilling alteration, the one that froze Noah's family to the marrow. It was not the addition of a sound, it was the subtraction of them all. The birds that normally filled the air with morning song fell silent, simultaneously, as though an invisible hand had closed their throats. Not a single trill remained. The insects that constantly hummed through the fields, the background sound of life itself, vanished. Nature's ambient buzz was switched off, creating a supernatural acoustic void. Even the wind, which always whispered across the plains, seemed to hold its breath. Not a leaf moved. Not a blade of grass stirred. The world stood motionless, like a corpse. An unnatural, absolute, oppressive calm spread over the land like a heavy shroud of foreboding. Noah, on the upper deck making a final inspection of the water tank's lashings, lifted his gaze from his work. His hands stopped moving. His sons, below securing the last compartments, also froze. They looked at one another across the vast structure, eyes wide. The patriarch, his spirit tuned to the divine after decades of constant communion, knew immediately what these signs meant. It was not peace. It was the void before collapse. He gathered his family in the ark's vast central compartment. In that moment of certainty, faith rose above the deepest fear, sustained by the hope that the plan was unfolding. He descended slowly along the inner ramp. They were all there, Naamah, her face a mask of apprehension, Shem, solid and silent, Ham, pale, his usual sarcasm replaced by barely concealed terror, Japheth, trembling slightly yet holding his ground. The daughters-in-law clustered together, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were white. Noah looked at them one by one. His voice, when he spoke, was not a shout, but it struck the absolute silence like the blow of a mallet. The time has come. Today the gathering will begin. No further explanation was needed. 120 years of spiritual and practical preparation had led to this culminating moment. Abstract faith was about to meet tangible reality. The first visible sign was not in the sky. It was on the earth. Japheth, posted as lookout at the entrance, was the first to see it. "Father," he said, his voice breaking. "Dust." Noah stepped out and stood at the top of the massive ramp. He stared toward the horizon. A distant cloud of dust was swelling in the western distance. But as he watched, he saw another cloud to the east. And then another to the north. And another to the south. It was not the characteristic cloud of a sandstorm, nor the identifiable plume of an army on the march. It was something entirely different in texture and behavior. These were not chaotic clouds, they were lines, organized columns, more organic, more alive, all converging toward a single point on the earth, the ark. As they drew closer with inexorable determination, they could discern that they were massive herds of animals, but not like any herd they had ever seen. They came in perfectly formed pairs, male and female. They moved with supernatural resolve, a divine instinct that utterly transcended known migration patterns, geographic barriers, and mutual fear. The first to arrive were the elephants, two majestic giants, a primal-era pair whose rhythmic, coordinated steps made the ground tremble beneath their massive feet. They did not advance in panic, but with regal solemnity. They climbed the ramp, which groaned under their weight, and their large, unusually wise eyes looked at Noah with deep recognition. Noah's faith became tangible in that miracle. It was a gaze that surpassed any normal animal comprehension, as though they fully understood their crucial role in this cosmic drama. Noah laid a trembling hand on the male's flank, and the beast dipped slightly before entering its designated stall, fitted to its size with perfect precision. Behind them came the giraffes, their impossibly long necks stretched toward the sky as if seeking one last look at the sun before the coming judgment. Then the lions, two of them, a male with a dark mane and a sleek female. But they did not come hunting, they did not roar to claim territory. They walked with terrifying calm, muscles rippling, golden eyes fixed on the ark's entrance. What was truly miraculous, what made Naamah choke back a sob, was not only the ordered procession. It was the supernatural peace reigning between species normally at odds. Predator and prey walked side by side in parallel columns, without visible fear, without latent aggression, without the constant tension of the food chain that ordinarily defined their interactions. The wolf and the lamb. The leopard and the goat. The bear and the deer. The wildcat and the field mouse. All moved in perfect harmony, like a prophetic vision of Eden briefly restored. The killing instinct had been divinely suspended. Bloodlust had been replaced by unified purpose. It was as though the world as it should be, as it had been originally designed before the fall, had returned for a brief moment before judgment, a fleeting glimpse of redeemed creation. The birds arrived in flocks so dense and organized that they literally darkened the sky. It was a river of feathers. Majestic eagles flew alongside humble doves. Ominous vultures shared the air with vibrant hummingbirds. Each species found its precise way to the designated openings and perches on the ark's upper deck, as if following an invisible map drawn within their hearts. Reptiles slid forward in coordinated pairs, forming a living tapestry over the ground. Snakes that would normally avoid one another by survival instinct now moved in perfect synchrony, their scales shimmering with the colors of the rainbow that would soon promise a new beginning. Insects arrived in organized swarms forming complex patterns in the air, a humming cloud flowing in through the vents, butterflies of impossibly vibrant colors, beetles with iridescent shells, bees buzzing a song of divine purpose. Every creature, from the largest mammoth to the smallest mosquito, found its assigned place instantly. Noah's family, who had prepared for chaos, for struggle, for having to cage beasts by force, instead found themselves mere witnesses, ushers in a divine theater. They worked tirelessly against the clock, speaking hardly at all, guiding the animals with gestures toward their specific compartments with supernatural efficiency. There was no confusion. No placement errors. No conflict. Instinctive knowledge guided each creature to its space. The massive elephants found their stall. The felines settled into their cages without protest or signs of distress. The birds perched. The ark, which had seemed so vast and empty during the lonely years of construction, now gradually filled with the multidimensional sound of life, deep grunts, lowing, chirps, buzzing, the rasp of scales and the clatter of hooves, all blending into a complex symphony of cosmic survival. And yet it was not the chaotic sound of an overcrowded menagerie. A palpable peace reigned, an unbreakable calm that could only come from the divine hand directing every movement. As the animals streamed in without pause, Noah noticed something extraordinary that widened his understanding. His faith grew with every species he saw. It was not only the common animals of his region. Creatures arrived he had never seen, beasts from distant lands no human eye had ever beheld, animals with colors and forms that defied imagination, lizards with frills, giant mammals cloaked in woolly fur, birds that could not fly but ran like the wind. And the ark itself revealed another miracle of design. It was larger on the inside than it appeared on the outside, a spatial mystery that expanded to accommodate the astonishing diversity of creation. Hours passed, then days. The sun rose and set over the endless procession. The family worked in punishing shifts, sleeping barely at all, eating standing up. Noah remained awake and vigilant, standing beside the ramp. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He oversaw each arrival with mounting reverent awe. His faith knew no rest. Every pair of animal eyes that looked at him as they passed represented a universe of divine design, a living testament to infinite creativity that now depended upon his obedience. At dusk on the sixth day, the procession began to thin. The rarest and most exotic animals arrived last, creatures from the depths of caves, pale and blind, creatures from mountain peaks with snow-white fur. When the final animal, a small, mysterious creature, a reptile with jewel-colored feathers, entered the ark with precise, deliberate motion, a deep, final silence fell over the outside world. The procession was finished. The air was charged and heavy, and the sky bore a sickly green cast. Noah stood on the ramp. He knew intuitively in his spirit that this was the culminating moment. With a heart full of faith, he took one last long look at the world he had known for 600 years, the fields he had tilled, the trees beneath whose shade he had rested, the distant mountains that had defined his horizon. Soon it would all be erased. He drew a deep breath, knowing it was the last time he would breathe the air of the condemned old world. Inside, he said hoarsely to his family, Shem, Ham, Japheth, their wives, Naamah. One by one they entered, without looking back. Noah was the last. With steady steps, despite the overwhelming emotional weight, he crossed the threshold. He turned, ready to use the complex system of pulleys and levers they had designed to seal the door from within. But he did not have to. The great massive door, the ramp that had been the final project of decades of labor, began to close without any visible human intervention. It was not the family that moved it. An invisible force, a silent and absolute power, guided it gently yet with final determination. There came the creak of wood, the groan of gopher against gopher, and then a dull, definitive sound, a final thud that rang through creation like the blow of a cosmic hammer on the coffin of the old world. The ark was sealed. And they were inside. The first 7 days inside the hermetically sealed ark were marked by a supernatural stillness, almost oppressive. Outside, the world continued on its way. The mockers, seeing the door shut, grew bold again. They came closer and pounded on the wood. "What is it, Noah? Is the party over? Open up." But their voices sounded muffled, distant. Inside, the silence was so deep they could hear the accelerated pounding of their own hearts. The animals, normally vocal, remained in an unsettling calm, as if they understood the solemnity of the moment. The family moved through their tasks, preparing the final systems, checking the vast food supplies, ensuring every creature was secure. The only light came from oil lamps and from the roof lattice, which emitted a dim, strangely tinted glow. In the tension of waiting, faith was their only comfort. The air was thick, saturated with the penetrating smell of pitch, gopher wood, and the thousand animal scents, a complex fragrance that would be their world for the coming year. On the morning of the exact 7th day after the final sealing, the first external sound arrived. It was not the apocalyptic roar Noah had expected. It was a soft but persistent tapping, like a small finger rhythmically touching the roof. Japheth looked up. "Father." Then another drop struck. And another. And another. A random pattern growing in frequency. Soon, the isolated tapping became a constant drumming. The drumming swelled into a deafening roar that grew exponentially, as if 1,000 armies were marching across the roof. The floodgates of the heavens had opened. But that was only the prelude. As the rain fell with a fury that became a solid wall of water, a deeper and more primordial sound began to rise from the very depths of the earth, a planetary groan, a low vibrating rumble that shook the ark's hull. Then came the definitive thunder, a sound so colossal it transcended hearing, a pure vibration that rattled the ark to its foundations, making every plank tremble. The springs of the great deep had burst. Subterranean oceans, held back since the world's foundation, were erupting violently toward the surface. The ark, which had remained motionless, began to move. A gentle sway. Then a violent jolt. And then, with a colossal groan of wood displacing the world, the 300-cubit structure began to float. The moment the ark broke free from the earth was not a gentle rise. It was a fracture. The water, surging from both sky and ground, did not rise like a tide, it exploded like an eruption. The springs of the great deep, freed from their geological prisons, burst in colossal geysers that tore the earth's crust. The ark, which had stood immobile and stable, was slammed by a wall of subterranean water. There was a deafening crack, a high, piercing groan of gopher wood so sharp it went through the ears and settled into the bones. It was the sound of 300 cubits of timber being subjected to titanic forces for which no human structure had ever been designed. The ground, their only constant, vanished. The family was thrown violently. Objects not secured became projectiles. In that instant, the animal's supernatural silence shattered. It was a symphony of panic, the primal terror of creation facing the unknown. The elephants, in their reinforced compartment, trumpeted with a low vibrating note that shook the entire structure. The great felines, tigers, lions, leopards, roared not with aggression, but with guttural fear. Apes and monkeys shrieked, a high sound of terror disturbingly close to human weeping. Cattle bellowed, sheep bleated, horses screamed, and from the lower deck came the collective hiss of thousands of reptiles. The Ark was now a pendulum of chaos, a floating asylum on a sea of annihilation. Noah's family, bruised and terrified, clung to the beams. Fear was overwhelming, a cold tide threatening to drown them from within. But faith was a work order. The lamps. Noah shouted over the roar, his voice broken by the sheer force of chaos. Shem, the restraints for the predators. Ham, Japheth, the livestock. Naamah, check the grain stores. They worked in near total gloom, lit only by the uncertain flicker of oil lamps swinging wildly, casting monstrous shadows that danced with the ark's motion. The floor tilted at impossible angles. Calming the agitated beasts was not a matter of gentle words, it was an act of suicidal faith. Shem, hands trembling but face steady, approached the lion's compartment as they battered the bars. He placed his hand on the wood, feeling the vibration of the animal's terror, and prayed, not that the beast would calm, but that God's design would hold. Ham and Japheth struggled on the lower deck, slipping in water already seeping through floor joints, designed for drainage, not for this assault, and in the manure of terrified animals. An ox, eyes rolling white, had broken its tether and was charging blindly through the darkness. It took them hours, risking their lives, to corner it and secure it again, while the ark was tossed about like a toy.
Lord,
through the reinforced upper openings, the lattices designed for air, not for sight, they could glimpse fragments of the end of the world. It was not rain, it was a sheet of water so dense the very concept of drops became meaningless. It was the sky collapsing. And the sound, the multidimensional sound of destruction, was overwhelming. There was the monotone rain, a white roar that drowned everything. There were the raging waters of the abyss. But beneath that, they heard other sounds, the dull thunder of human structures collapsing, the towers of Enoch, the walls of Zillah, everything reduced to rubble in minutes. The sound of massive rocks tearing free, whole mountain slopes sliding into valleys. The sound of an entire complex civilization, with its markets, its temples, its forges, being erased completely within hours, as if it had never existed. And during the first hours, the worst sound of all, the screams. Human screams, sharp, desperate, swallowed almost instantly by the roar of the elements. Noah stood at the highest opening available, the main ventilation lattice. He clung to the beam and stared out. He saw the world transformed into a living aquatic nightmare. He saw the familiar trees of his own olive grove, the labor of his life, disappear beneath the rising waters. He saw the hill where they had buried their dead grandchildren become a temporary island, then a green stain, then nothing. He saw bodies, people he had known. He saw Elam, the shepherd who had laughed, floating face down, his staff still in his hand. He saw the youths who had thrown stones, their pale faces frozen in a final grimace of terror. He felt no sick joy in vindication. There was no, "I told you so," in his heart. He felt a sorrow so deep, so vast as the ocean now covering the world, that it filled his soul to the brim. Every mockery received, every insult endured, every stone thrown, at bottom, it had all been a desperate cry for help from souls now literally drowning in their own stubborn wickedness. His silent tears mingled with the condensation on the ark's wood, tears of genuine mourning for a world with so much divine potential, so much original beauty, so tragically squandered by human choice. The 40 days and 40 nights of unceasing rain were a watery hell. The concept of day and night dissolved. Darkness was nearly total. The sun had vanished completely behind a ceiling of clouds so thick and low that even noon brought only a sickly dimness filtering through the roof lattice. The oil lamps, carefully rationed, were their only son. The ark was violently battered, like a miraculous wooden shell in the hands of an enraged giant determined to test every joint and every peg. Waves the size of entire mountains, born from the war between the waters of heaven and the waters of the abyss, lifted the massive vessel to dizzying heights that stole the breath away. The family's stomachs remained in a constant knot. Seasickness was perpetual torture. And then the ship would drop abruptly into chasms of dark water that seemed bottomless. In those moments, the silence was almost worse, the weightless instant before impact, when the ark slammed into the trough with a crash that made the animals leap and threaten to split the keel. The family learned to move within this unstable world. They developed instinctive sea legs, moving in synchrony with the sway, anticipating the jolts. The animals, too, adapted remarkably. After the initial panic, they calmed, sinking into a semi-hibernation state, a supernatural stillness imposed by the Creator to preserve their strength and the family's sanity. After exactly 40 days and 40 nights, as abruptly as it had begun, the rain stopped. The relative silence that followed was almost more psychologically terrifying than the constant roar. The white noise that had been their universe ceased. What remained was the sound of dripping water, the constant creak of timber, and the vast, unimaginable sound of an endless ocean sloshing against the ark's sides. It was a sonic void screaming the total absence of life outside. But the waters did not retreat. The rain had stopped, yet the springs of the deep continued vomiting their primordial contents. The waters kept rising, more quietly now, but inexorably. The ark now floated on an infinite, monotonous ocean. No land was visible in any direction, only a vast watery desert under an equally empty, gray, sunless sky. The world they had known had literally ceased to exist. Every trace of humanity, every work of human hands, every memory of civilization, everything lay irreversibly submerged beneath miles of water. The waters had risen many meters above the peaks of the highest mountains, erasing the former world completely. Noah measured time not by day and night, but by tasks, the rhythm of survival, meticulous feeding of animals, cleaning of stalls, checking supplies. 150 full days passed like this, with the ark floating alone on a sea of universal death. It was a hopeless monotony, a shell of miraculous wood containing all remaining terrestrial life, a final fragile refuge in the immensity of judgment. Daily routine set in as a mechanism of mental survival, precise feeding, exhaustive cleaning to prevent disease, constant maintenance of ventilation systems, and always the patient waiting for an end that did not come. Noah's faith was tested in this perpetual darkness as never before. No comforting sun, no familiar moon, no guiding stars, no solid ground, only the endless monotone rocking of waves and the constant unsettling sound of wood groaning under pressure. In the deepest part of his heart, he held the divine promise with unbreakable strength. He clung to hope against all visible evidence. He knew this terrible judgment was not the final end, but the painful labor of a new beginning. The world had not been destroyed, it had been washed. And he, the guardian of the seed, waited patiently for the waters to recede, floating alone over the abyss in silent communion with the God who had placed him there. Time inside the ark lost all external meaning. It dissolved into a temporal fog where days merged into one another without clear demarcations. Without sunrise and sunset, without lunar phases, days and weeks became an endless succession of repetitive tasks. The family developed its own artificial rhythm, a cycle based solely on the urgent biological needs of their thousands of passengers. Feeding was a monumental task. Each day required calculating exact rations, ensuring predators received their meat, preserved, or, according to some traditions, maintained in a hibernating state, without threatening others, ensuring herbivores had sufficient forage. It was a ballet of logistical precision. Cleaning was essential for survival, removing accumulated manure that threatened to generate deadly gases, scrubbing stalls, keeping ventilation functioning so the stale air would not become unbreathable. The smell inside the ark was a complex blend: the sweet scent of hay, the acrid reek of waste, the musky perfume of the great felines, everything mixed with the ever-present aroma of gopher wood and pitch permeating every corner. The sounds grew familiar: the soft chewing of ruminants, the scratch of claws, the occasional snort, the hum of insects, the random song of birds offering unexpected flashes of beauty. The supernatural peace between species persisted, a miraculous biological truce. The human family adapted. They developed a system of silent communication, gestures, glances, instant understanding. They learned each animal's habits. Shem had a gift with the felines. Ham became the expert on birds. Japheth preferred the largest creatures, the pachyderms. The daughters-in-law specialized in the smallest and most delicate. Noah oversaw everything, moving tirelessly among the 3 levels, his staff tapping softly on the wooden floor. His faith did not visibly falter, yet inwardly, in the stillness of artificial night, he would sit near the lattice and stare into absolute darkness, meditating on the paradox of judgment and mercy. He knew that every soul who had mocked now lay in the depths. The certainty brought him deep pain, a silent mourning for lost humanity. Physical health was a constant concern. An illness could be catastrophic. They developed rigorous cleaning protocols, boiled the water, inspected the food. Miraculously, no major plague afflicted them, but colds, fevers, and muscle aches were part of their reality. The animals faced challenges as well. Some struggled to adapt to the extreme confinement. Others showed signs of stress. Yet, miraculously, none died. Pregnant females gave birth. Healthy young were born in the midst of darkness, bringing tangible hope, new life blossoming in the middle of universal death. Weeks turned into monotonous months. The ark rocked constantly, the pulse of their existence. To distract themselves, they told stories of the old world, sang simple songs, played basic games. But always, the persistent question, when will it end? Faith sustained them against despair, yet they wrestled with uncertainty, boredom, and the claustrophobia of knowing their entire world had been reduced to this wooden structure floating on a sea of death. Finally, after exactly 150 days of this endless drift, they felt a physical change. The perpetual motion shifted. It was not a wave. It was an unusual jolt, a dull scrape, a vibration rising from the depths beneath the hull. Then came a more defined shock that made everyone stagger. The ark had touched bottom. After months of rocking, the sudden stability felt strange, unsettling. They were no longer adrift. They were anchored on the summit of a mountain, grounded upon what would become the emerging new world. The waters had begun their descent. The exhausting wait was not over, but now it carried a new character, the silent expectation of what they would find when they could finally open the door. Here is the continuation. This section covers the long wait on the mountaintop, the psychological trial of patience, and the missions of the birds, expanding the paragraphs of your original text. The silence that followed the impact was deeper than that of the outer world. It was an inner silence. The perpetual movement, the rolling and pitching that had become the rhythm of their lives for 150 days, had ceased. The ark was motionless, anchored. And the stillness was torment. Their bodies, which had developed ark legs to instinctively compensate for unstable footing, now betrayed them. When they took a step, they wobbled, expecting a sway that never came. The dizziness of stillness was worse than that of motion. The world felt wrong. Internal sounds amplified to an unbearable degree. The drip of condensation on the inner walls sounded like a hammer. The chewing of an ox was a dull thunder. They could hear one another breathing in adjoining cabins, the rub of cloth against skin, the whispers. The air was thick, stale, heavy with the breath of thousands of creatures and 8 human souls, a miasma of confined life. Outside, for the first time in months, they heard wind, not the roar of the storm, but the lone, sharp lament of wind blowing over a dead world, a sound that slipped through the roof lattice and reminded them of their absolute solitude. The patient waiting after the ark had come to rest firmly on the mountains of Ararat was perhaps the most difficult psychological test of all. The storm had been a crisis demanding action and endurance. The floating had been a drift of blind faith. But this immobility, was a test of pure patience. The natural human temptation to open the door immediately and run out into freedom was overwhelming. "It's still," Hem said a few days into the immobility, his voice rough with anxiety. He struck the inner wall of the ramp. "We've hit land. Father, for the love of God, open the door. I need to breathe air that isn't foul. I need to see the sky." "Not yet," Noah replied. His eyes remained closed. He sat beside the central pillar, his spirit attuned to the outer world. "Not yet?" Ham snapped. "Wait for what? Hell is over." "Judgment is over," Shem corrected, his voice low and steady. "Waiting is the final test. We wait for our Father's word." "Our Father waits for God's word." Ham shouted, his claustrophobia turning into fury. "We're alive, but we're in a tomb. The air stinks, the food is rotting, the animals are restless. What else do we need to know?" "That the land is safe," Noah said, finally opening his eyes. There was a calm in them that enraged Ham and yet anchored him. That the promise was not merely to survive the flood, but to inherit a habitable earth. Divine prudence requires additional patience until the perfect moment. To go out prematurely would be disobedience. In that forced tension, Noah held to faith and hope, despite fear of mutiny from his own son. So they waited. Weeks became months. They counted time by oil lamps burning down, by cycles of feeding and cleaning. Routine was their anchor, and also their prison. Through the only opening available, the roof lattice that admitted their only light, they could progressively see the waters descending. Noah climbed up every morning, scaling the inner structure, to peer out through that slit at the new world. At first, he saw only sky, a painfully bright blue, clean of all humanity's corruption. Then, as the water level dropped, he saw the vast gray ocean stretching to infinity. Until one day, 40 days after the ark had grounded, Shem, who had climbed up for inspection, shouted. It was not a shout of joy, but of awe. "Father! Rock!" Noah climbed with an agility that belied his centuries. He looked out. There they were. The highest mountain peaks appeared first, like ghostly islands emerging from an immense sea of mud. They were not the green, forested summits of the old world. They were the bones of the earth, washed, black, and shining with water, like the teeth of a colossal skull. The landscape was lunar, desolate, a vast cemetery of drying mud and bare rock. Not a single recognizable tree remained. Not a single building stood. No visible trace of civilization existed. The earth was a tabula rasa. The sight brought no comfort, but a profound confirmation of their solitude. They were the only ones. Humanity had been reduced to 8 souls in a wooden box atop the highest mountain in the world. Noah surveyed the dead landscape and declared they would wait another 40 days. At the end of that period, the water had visibly receded, exposing the upper slopes of their own mountain. Mud covered everything like a shroud. Noah knew it was time to explore, but not with their lives. His faith urged prudence. He would not open the main door, whose opening would be irreversible. He would use the window, the lattice designed for this purpose. He chose the raven first, a pragmatic choice. It was strong, intelligent, a scavenger. It could fend for itself in this hostile, dead world. He opened the lattice, and the air of the new world rushed in. It did not smell of life. It smelled of mud, decay, salt, and a strange purity like ozone. The raven flew out with a caw that sounded unnaturally loud in the crushing silence of the new world. It did not return. The family watched from the opening. They saw it, a black dot against the gray sky, flying back and forth. It was not seeking a nest. It was seeking food. It perched on newly exposed rocks, probing the devastated landscape. The raven, evidently, found sustenance among the corpses of marine and terrestrial creatures that began to surface as the waters retreated. It was a grim image, but a realistic confirmation. The earth was a graveyard, but it was land. After 7 full days of watching the raven come and go but never return to the ark, Noah chose a different scout. Hope guided his decision. He sent a dove. It was a deliberate contrast. The raven sought death in order to live. The dove, a symbol of purity, needed life. It needed a clean place to rest. The family watched as the white bird flew away, a symbol of hope against the gray mud. Hours passed. The sun, now a constant companion in the clear sky, began to descend. Morale inside the ark sank with it. If the dove found nothing. At dusk, the exhausted beating of wings reached the window. Japheth extended his arm, and the dove landed on it, trembling. It returned, and its feet were coated with mud. It had found nowhere to set its feet down dry. The land was not yet habitable. Disappointment struck the family like a physical blow. The waiting had to continue. Noah waited patiently another exact 7 days, 7 days of cleaning, feeding, and waiting, while the air in the ark grew tighter and more tense. He sent the dove again. The waiting that day was the most agonizing of all. Each hour dragged. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent. Evening stained the clouds purple. Naamah and the daughters-in-law prepared supper in silence. The sound of the mortar was the only noise. Then, a flash of white. The dove returned, flying with more strength this time. It landed on the windowsill. And miraculously, in its beak, it carried a fresh olive leaf. It was not a dry twig. It was not debris. It was a fresh leaf, vibrant green, full of life and chlorophyll. It was wet, newly plucked. It was the most glorious moment since they had entered the ark. Naamah choked back a cry and stepped backward. Ham, the cynic, lost his breath. Shem smiled for the first time in a year. Noah, his hands visibly trembling, extended a finger and touched the leaf. It was real. Life. In the midst of the universal graveyard, an olive tree had sprouted. Stubborn life, the Creator's original design, had overcome death. The earth was healing. That small leaf was more eloquent than any speech, more powerful than any prophecy. It was creation's sign of forgiveness. Noah waited another 7 full days. It was the final test of patience. The ark now hummed with new energy, joyful anticipation. The animals sensed it, shifting restlessly in their stalls, smelling the living air coming through the lattice.
Oh my God.
Noah sent the dove a third and final time. With absolute faith, he let it go.
Thank you, Father, for your
This
mercy
time, they did not wait at the
and for
window.
this new beginning.
They continued their tasks, but their ears were alert. Evening came. The dove did not return. It vanished into the reborn horizon. It had found its home. The message was clear and unmistakable: it was time to emerge. But even then, Noah waited. The sign from the earth had come. Now he needed the sign from heaven. He knelt on the wooden deck that had been his world and prayed, not asking to leave, but giving thanks for the confirmation. Then the voice of God resounded in his heart with the same supernatural clarity with which he had spoken more than a century earlier. His spirit received the command with gratitude. Go out of the ark, you and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, of birds and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may swarm on the earth, and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. Those simple words, the direct command, brought uncontrollable tears to Noah's eyes. They were not the tears of pain he had shed for the lost world, nor the tears of relief at the olive leaf. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. Divine faithfulness. The promise had been fulfilled. The circle had closed. He rose, his body old and weary, but his spirit upright. My sons, his steady voice carried through the ark's 3 levels. The day has come. Open the door. With hands visibly trembling, not only from age and accumulated exhaustion, but from the emotional magnitude of the moment, Noah approached the great door. His sons followed. Together, the 4 men set their shoulders against the immense beams of the internal sealing mechanism. It had been shut tight for more than a full year, sealed by the hand of God and hardened by months submerged under unimaginable water pressure. The pitch had fused with the wood, creating a monolithic seal. They pushed. The wood did not give. Together. Shem shouted, his voice echoing in the now silent hull. They pushed again. A high groan sounded, the cry of protesting gopher wood, but the door held firm. It was not a simple door, it was a wall. The levers, Noah said, his voice calm but firm. They brought the long, thick oak beams they had kept for this exact purpose. They wedged them into the grooves they had designed more than a century earlier. Ham, with his pragmatic strength, gripped one. Shem and Japheth the other. Now, Noah commanded. They levered with the full weight of their bodies. Sweat broke across their foreheads, the stale air of the ark burned their lungs. There was a crack, like the breaking of a giant bone. The pitch of the seal fractured. A thin line of light, brighter than 1,000 lightning bolts, cut through the ark's dimness. It was so intense, so pure, that it hurt their eyes, long accustomed to darkness. The entire family recoiled instinctively, shielding their faces as if struck. And with that light, the air came in. It was a breath from another world. The air they had breathed for a year had been a thick stew, the sharp stench of manure ammonia, the musky smell of thousands of damp coats, the stale aroma of stored grain, and the breath of 8 human beings. This new air was so pure, so clean, so cold and thin at the mountain's height that it hurt as it entered their lungs. It smelled of nothing, and yet it smelled of wet rock, of water, of ozone, of sky. It was the smell of a world without life, but also of a world without corruption. It was the scent of creation on its first day. More. Noah shouted. They drove the levers again. The seal broke completely. The massive door ramp, freed from its prison, gave way with a thunderous crash. It fell heavily, tons of wood striking the mountain rock with a boom, the first sound made by man in the new age. Light flooded the ark's interior, blinding them all. They stood paralyzed at the threshold, blinking, pupils constricting in pain. The outside world was a sensory assault. For a year their world had been dark wood, constant motion, and either deafening roar or stale silence. Now they faced absolute silence, total stillness, and a searing light. Noah was the first to move. Slowly, with the solemnity of a priest entering the Holy of Holies, he descended the ramp. His sandals touched the mountain rock. It was solid. Firm. It did not move. After a year of perpetual nausea, the sensation of stable ground was the strangest and most overwhelming blessing. His knees buckled from the sheer shock of stability. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the pure air of the new world. It was like drinking cold water after a lifetime of thirst. Then he lifted his gaze. The sky was a blue so deep and violent it seemed unreal. The sun, a white orb of fire, hung overhead without the filter of the old world's miasma. Everything was washed, clean to the bone. And the world beneath that sky was empty. Rock. Mud. Water. As far as the eye could see, a desert of shining sludge and bare stone. There was no tree. No blade of grass. No building. The entire world had been erased, reduced to its foundational canvas. Silence was total, absolute, broken only by the lone whisper of wind over naked rock and the distant dripping of water still retreating in far valleys. It was terrifying in its complete desolation and glorious in its pristine purity, a world washed of corruption, radically purified, empty of humanity yet filled with limitless divine potential. One by one, the family stepped out cautiously, like creatures newly born. Naamah emerged and tears ran down her face as she felt sunlight on her skin for the first time in a year. Japheth laughed, a short, nervous laugh, as he turned in place, overwhelmed by the immensity of open space. Ham stood still at the end of the ramp, eyes sweeping the horizon, his usual cynicism replaced by mute, dreadful awe. They were alive, but they were alone. Noah fell to his knees, not to pray, not yet, but under the weight of survival. He bowed and kissed the cold, damp rock, solid ground. Then began the ordered process of releasing the animals. It was the exact reverse of the miraculous procession they had witnessed. Noah gave the signal. Clean air and open space seeped into the ark, and an uneasy murmur ran through all three decks. The divine truce was ending. The animals came out in an orderly fashion, but now not with supernatural calm, rather with the pent-up urgency of life. The majestic elephants descended the ramp carefully, their great feet echoing on stone. Reaching the ground, the male lifted his trunk and released a triumphant trumpet that rang through the empty mountains. The birds were next. It was an explosion. The family had to duck as thousands of birds, freed from their perches, surged out through the opening in a cloud of feathers and trills, filling the empty sky with sound and motion for the first time. They rose in spirals, reclaiming the air. Then the rest came, pair by pair. The various felines stepped out with instinctive caution, scenting the new air, muscles tense. The male lion halted at the end of the ramp, mane stirring in the mountain wind. He opened his jaws and released a roar that made the family tremble. It was not the panic bellow from inside the ark, it was a roar of dominion, a claim of territory over a world without borders. Immediately, the deer, gazelles, and zebras emerging behind him scattered, their prey instincts restored in an instant. The ark's peace was broken. Nature's law had been reinstated. The world was wild again. For hours they watched creation pour over the naked landscape, spreading across the slopes, the larger creatures heading down to the muddy valleys below, the smaller ones seeking refuge in rock crevices. When the last animal, a small armadillo, descended the ramp and vanished, a new silence fell. The ark, home, prison, salvation, stood behind them now empty and dead, a wooden shell on a mountaintop. Noah looked around. They were alone, 8 human souls on an empty planet. Faith held him in that loneliness. The first thing Noah did in this new world was not to build shelter. It was not to search for food. It was to build an altar. From the very first moment he established the centrality of God in the new humanity. "Sons," he said, voice firm, "bring stones. Not with tools. Not with the arrogance of the old world's masonry." They searched the mountain slope for rough rocks, stones washed and purified by the flood. They built a simple, honest altar, as raw and real as their tested faith. With humble hands he raised a monument to hope. Then Noah faced the hardest part. With reverence, he approached the clean animals that God had instructed him to bring in greater number, in sevens, set apart from the others. They had been his companions on the journey. But this was their divine purpose. He took from the clean animals and the clean birds and offered burnt offerings upon the stone altar. The fire caught. And in the pure, pristine air of the new world's morning, the smoke rose, the first column of smoke in a year. It climbed in a thin, straight, fragrant pillar, the first offering of worship on renewed earth, the first act of gratitude from redeemed man to his Redeemer. The scent of the sacrifice, the pleasing aroma, rose beyond the clouds, beyond the blue sky, and reached the heart of God. It was not the smell of blood and violence that had characterized the old world, but the fragrance of a grateful and obedient heart acknowledging the source of its salvation. And God, perceiving that aroma, responded within his heart. His heart inclined toward obedience. "I will never again curse the ground because of man," the Lord declared in intimate communication to Noah's spirit, "for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done." It was a realistic acknowledgement of human nature, something even the flood could not purge completely. Yet it was also a magnanimous divine restraint. God was promising never again to use the waters of universal judgment. As long as the earth remains, the promise continued in Noah's heart, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Stability had returned. Life could begin again. And as the family watched the smoke rise, a passing cloud released a light drizzle. Sunlight pierced it. And there, against the backdrop of desolate mountains, God set his bow in the clouds. The rainbow. As the family watched the smoke of sacrifice ascend in the pristine air, a solitary cloud formed over the mountain. It was a white, harmless cloud, yet its shadow covered the altar. And then, from it, a light drizzle began to fall. It was like a scream. The family reacted with primal terror. Naamah stifled a sob and stumbled back. Japheth shuddered, eyes fixed on the drops darkening the rock. Ham cursed under his breath and stared up in panic and resentment. To them, the sound of rain was not a whisper of life, it was the drumroll of judgment, the sound of heaven's floodgates opening, the prelude to universal death. Noah alone remained still, standing beside the flaming altar. He lifted his weathered face into the drizzle, closed his eyes, and let it run down the creases of his brow. He was trembling, not from cold, but from an emotion so vast it threatened to break him. Faith held against the deepest fear, sustaining hope in the promise. Then sunlight, shining from the horizon, passed through the drizzle. And God set his bow in the clouds. It was not a small or faint arc. It was a cosmic warband, a semicircle of liquid, vibrant color stretching from one end of the visible world to the other. Its colors were impossibly pure, a red like the blood of the sacrifice, a blue like the depth of the abyss, a green like the olive leaf, a violet like a king's robe. The family came out of their stupor, mouths open, necks craned toward the sky. They had never seen anything like it. It was the same optical phenomenon that had existed from the beginning of creation, light refracting through water, but now, after judgment, it was invested with a new and awe-filled meaning. The rainbow was especially significant because it appeared in the clouds. The very clouds that had brought the destroying flood now carried the colorful promise that they would never again do so in universal fury. Noah understood first. He fell to his knees, not in fear this time, but in overwhelming worship. It was the divine weapon of war, the bow of the cosmic hunter, hung symbolically in the heavens. And it was disarmed, its string turned upward toward the sky, away from the earth. A symbol of enduring peace. "It is the covenant," Noah whispered, his voice broken with emotion. "It is the sign." And God spoke, not only to Noah's heart, but to all of them, a voice that was not sound but certainty, a promise imprinted on their souls. "Behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you. I will never again cut off all flesh by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. This is the sign of the covenant that I establish between me and you and every living creature. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass, when I bring clouds over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the clouds. And I will remember my covenant." Noah's family began the monumental task of repopulating the earth from this new starting point. Faith and hope were their only resources. It was a solitude no other human generation would ever know. There was no infrastructure. No cities. No other tribes. Only 8 people on an entire planet, with the echo of a drowned world beneath their feet. It was not easy. The world was a demanding place, a vast field of mud and rock, stripped of the accumulated resources of the old world. They had to begin from nothing. But God blessed them. The earth, washed and fertilized, was incredibly fertile. The seeds they had preserved in the ark sprouted with astonishing vitality. They were fruitful and multiplied, as commanded. The sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the progenitors of all the nations that would follow. Shem, the one of upright heart. Japheth, the builder. And Ham, the one who watched. Each carried in his genetic inheritance the memory of the flood and the promise of the rainbow. But the full narrative does not end on the summit of that mountain, in that moment of purity and promise. The rainbow was a promise that God would never again destroy the world with water. It was not a promise that man would not try to destroy himself. The years passed. The earth grew green again. The valleys filled not with water, but with grain and vines. Noah, the man of the soil, the first farmer of the new world, planted a vineyard. He tended it with the same care with which he had built the ark. And the vine bore its fruit. He made wine, the first wine of the reborn world. And on a day of celebration, perhaps commemorating the anniversary of their leaving the ark, the man who had carried the weight of the world, the man who had been the pillar of righteousness for centuries, finally allowed himself to rest. He drank the wine. But he did not know the potency of that new fruit, born of a purified earth. He became drunk. The patriarch who had walked with God, the man who had never faltered, collapsed in his tent and lay naked in the privacy of sleep, vulnerable for the first time. It was the exhausted sleep of a man who had finally let down his guard after a lifetime of cosmic vigilance. That was when Ham entered the tent. He saw his father's accidental nakedness. He saw the prophet, the savior, the moral pillar, reduced to a simple drunken man, snoring in his own vulnerability. For Ham, the one who had always doubted in his heart, the one who had feared but also resented his father's perfection, this moment was a revelation. It was the confirmation he had always sought: his father was no better than the men who had drowned. And instead of respectfully covering his father's weakness, instead of protecting the honor of the man who had saved his life, he felt a surge of triumphant contempt. He left the tent not in horror, but with a mocking smile. He went to find his brothers, Shem and Japheth, who were working in the field. "Come and see," he said in a tone that blended ridicule and scandal. "The great man of God. The righteous man. Come and see the dignity of the patriarch of the new world." Shem and Japheth exchanged a look of profound pain. It was not anger toward Ham, but shame for him. They understood the depth of their brother's sin. It was not the act of seeing, but the act of exposing and mocking. With tact and filial respect, they took a cloak. And they walked backward, eyes averted, so as not to participate in the humiliation. They entered the tent without looking and, with reverent motions, covered the man who was their father, honoring his dignity even, and especially, in his weakness. When Noah awoke and learned what his youngest son had done, the pain was deeper than any fear he had felt in the ark. The incident was a somber, tragic, and necessary reminder of persistent human reality. The flood had washed the earth physically clean of corruption, but it had not miraculously changed the human heart. Sin had not drowned. It had been a stowaway in the ark, hidden in the very nature of the survivors. The seed of evil had survived the voyage, proving that external salvation from judgment does not transform the fallen inner nature. Noah's complete legacy, therefore, is complex and multifaceted, resisting easy simplifications. Faith and obedience were tested in the fear and hope of the old world. On the one hand, he is the monumental hero of faith who obeyed against all human hope, the man who walked with God in a corrupt generation, the providential savior of all terrestrial life. On the other hand, he is also a realistic reminder that rescue from impending judgment is not final redemption. His story is as much about necessary divine judgment as it is about surprising divine grace. It is as much about persistent human corruption, which survived even the annihilation of the world, as it is about the possibility of redemption through obedient faith. The ark itself became a powerful symbol that reverberates through all human history, a prophetic precursor of baptism, a metaphor of the church as a place of refuge, a perpetual reminder that God always preserves a faithful remnant, even amid the severest judgment. And the rainbow remains. It remains to this day, appearing faithfully after every rain, just as it was promised, reminding humanity, generation after generation, that no matter how dark the clouds become, God's promise remains unbroken. The waters of final universal judgment will never again come upon the whole earth. In every raindrop there is now an implicit promise of mercy. In every storm there is a reminder that divine wrath has self-imposed limits. And in every rainbow, in that scar of beauty across the sky, there is a visible echo of the covenant God solemnly made with a righteous man and with all creation. A colorful reminder that the last word, the word that spans the heavens, will always be grace, not judgment. Noah looked at the sky and understood that survival, too, was a calling. The rainbow was not only promise, but living memory of the love that overcomes judgment. The ark, once dismantled or abandoned on the high peaks of Ararat, immediately became a myth, but also a profound archetypal symbol that would shape human consciousness. It was not only proof of punishment, but physical evidence that grace and safety exist, even if only in a wooden box sealed by obedience. Its memory seeped into the legends of Noah's descendants, giving rise to global flood accounts in nearly all ancient cultures, from Sumer to the American tribes, each a distorted echo of the original event. The ark became a powerful metaphor of the church itself, seen as the sole vehicle of salvation through the waters of judgment. The pitch that sealed the vessel against the death outside came to symbolize atonement, the invisible, sticky covering that insulates the believer from the world's consequences. For Noah's sons and their later generations, the memory of the flood was not a horror story, it was a foundational narrative. It reminded them that even though the laws of physics and geology had been rewritten, God's promise remained the only constant. It taught them that human purpose did not lie in accumulating stone cities or pursuing personal glory, the sin of the former world, but in patient cultivation of the earth and humble worship. The flood, paradoxically, not only destroyed, it also baptized the planet, preparing it for a new covenant. The waters were not merely a weapon of destruction, they were the agent of cosmic purification. Every valley, every rock formation, every ocean basin bore the scar of that event, a silent reminder to posterity that human decisions have geological and cosmic resonance, yet divine patience always offers a path back. The final symbol, of course, remains the bow in the clouds. It is a visual reminder that the war is over. The rainbow is God's war bow laid down, hung as an ornament of peace, visible alike to righteous and unrighteous, a testimony that God's mercy does not depend on man's conduct, but on his own unbreakable oath. And so, beneath that seven-colored arc, humanity began its long, difficult, and hopeful march into the future.